Hi there! Remember that time a few years ago when I made a whole series of videos explaining the basics of English grammar? Anyway, because grammar and punctuation are so closely related, I wanted to share a little mental trick that instantly clarified a lot of punctuation rules for me, and that I still rely on when I'm thinking through the structures of my sentences. Now, as you'll recall from our discussion of grammar, grammar is a description of the systematic rules for putting words in order in a language. As we start to put words together, we can also begin to describe larger grammatical structures. So we start with words, which are, well, just words. Groups of words are called phrases. Some phrases can serve as important building blocks of sentences, like verb phrases or noun phrases that serve as subjects, while others, like prepositional or adverbial phrases, work as modifiers. Moving up from phrases, we get clauses, which are comprised of, at minimum, a subject-noun phrase and a verb phrase. Independent clauses have a subject and verb and can function perfectly fine as complete sentences by themselves. But dependent or subordinate clauses come equipped with subordinating conjunctions that make their grammatical sense incomplete. As a result, they can't stand alone and still be perceived as complete sentences. Okay, cool, thanks, but why do we care? Well, just imagine that all of these grammatical units are train cars. The more complete their grammatical structure, the heavier they are. So a phrase weighs more than a word, and an independent clause weighs more than anything else. And this sets us up to understand punctuation in a more intuitive way. See, words are so light that we usually don't need any punctuation to connect them. They can hold together just fine on their own. Independent clauses, though, are so heavy that we can't just put them next to each other and hope our train will hold together. In fact, you may have heard of run-on sentences before. A run-on sentence is not necessarily a long sentence. What's actually going on with a run-on sentence is that you have two or more independent clauses stuck together without any connecting punctuation. In that case, those train cars will separate as soon as the train gets going, and then you'll have runaway clauses loose on the tracks. Look out! Similarly, you may have heard of a comma splice, and that's an attempt to hold independent clauses together with just a comma. But look at that comma. It's so tiny and weak. As soon as the train gets going, those heavy independent clauses will just snap it. And then we're right back where we were with the runaway run-on. You could, however, reinforce the comma with a coordinating conjunction. This combo is strong enough to support the weight of two independent clauses. Or you could just use an inherently stronger connector, like a colon or semicolon. Neither of those will break under the weight of these grammatically heavy clauses. And this is the trick. If you think of a sentence as a train built out of grammatical cars with different weights, then you can imagine punctuation as a set of connectors with varying levels of strength. That way you don't have to remember a whole set of rules. You can just ask yourself how strong your connector needs to be and use the one that fits the situation. Now, there are a couple more things I want to show you before you're fully ready to conduct your own grammatical trains. The basic word order of English is subject, verb, object, and we read it left to right. That means that the subject of the main clause in a sentence is most naturally what comes first, in the same way that the locomotive is the first in line. That means that it's easier to connect things to the right end of a sentence than to the left. For example, you don't need any punctuation if you're attaching a prepositional phrase or a dependent clause after the main clause. But you'll need to use a comma to attach these light cars to the front of the train. Also, if you want to attach a unit somewhere it might not normally go, like if you want to insert a modifying phrase between the subject and verb, for example, you'll need to use some commas to hold it all together. And, of course, commas can connect items in lists. Sometimes when the items in a list get heavier and more complex, especially when they're built out of phrases or clauses held together by commas, it's helpful to use semicolons because that extra strength helps a little, and more importantly, because the visual difference between semicolons and commas helps to disambiguate the structure of the list. Finally, as we mentioned in the individual punctuation videos, some punctuation marks have specialized uses. The colon, for example, can be used to introduce a list, even if the individual items in the list are light enough not to need the strength of a colon. And sometimes you'll see a writer use a colon to connect a single word or short phrase to a sentence as a sort of dramatic conclusion. There's room for that usage, but a burly colon always feels like too much punctuation for such a little attachment, so I would usually prefer to see a nimble dash used instead. Speaking of dashes, if you want to be a rigid traditionalist, treat them as the strength equivalent of commas. Wherever a comma works, a dash will work as well. But the real value of the dash is in its emphatic energy. Because it has a tonal character that is distinct from other kinds of punctuation, You may find yourself craving its energy in a spot that would normally shatter a comma. But fear not, the dash is humming with its own electric power and it's up to the task. Purists might say a dash doesn't do the job, but I've seen dashes hold independent clauses together without any issue. So, as always, feel free to use dashes with impunity. The world will surely be better for it. Whatever you do, just remember that heavy train cars require strong connectors. You could memorize all the rules, or you could just remember this principle that will serve you well the vast majority of the time. At least, it's been serving me well for a good long time. Anyway, punctuation can only be so fun for so long, so I'm off. Happy punctuating, and I'll catch you later.